presentation is fundamentally designed to say is this. Africa, historically, Sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow Sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep Sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US or now China, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message. It doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about. Because if Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay? And that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight. Okay, so this is what it's fundamentally about. What I want to show you is how these structures are operating. It's just 20 minutes, so we can't do very much, but just to give you a little bit of an idea. And why I keep the ideology part there is because we are part of the producers of ideology. At universities and academic institutions, we are complicit in this whole enterprise. Okay, so the job of many Western academics is to convince Africans they have to keep doing what they're doing. Okay? And to show them it's your fault that you're poor. It's not our fault. It's your fault that you're poor. You know? So this is what we do in academic institutions, and I want to show that as well. We just start. This is what it's.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. So this is one of the sad video that I have to make, because how come the senior lecturers is comfortable to mention these things and they make sure that this information is going out to reach many people in Africa? And by him to be comfortable to say, to mention all these things, it's telling us that no matter how much Africa we try, how much effort that our leaders, people in the countries, are going to try to improve their living standard, the Western people, they are going to be crazy, or they won't allow these things to happen. Just for him to come out. I know and I believe that he's an academic. They create ideology, but again, as long as those ideology are meant to put a certain continent and countries underdeveloped, it's saying a lot. So African countries and African people that are living in Africa, they are not lazy people. I mentioned these things in one of my videos. They are not lazy people. But just because of the condition that we find ourselves in, we won't go far unless we become one of them. And you know what I mean. The academics that are also in African countries, they are the ones that are being used by the Western countries to penetrate in a country so that they can do whatever they want to do. The Western countries, or the northern part, we know that they are the one who came to colonize Africa. And they did not leave Africa within 1 decade. They have been living in the continent for so many years. Doing what? Uprooting all our mineral resources, taking our land from the native. They bring colonialization so that the African people who are resisting to be living or to be ruled under them, there is something that is going to be done to them. So African has been oppressed by these people for so many years. But for them to continue even after the country gains independence, it's saying a lot. Imagine the country it gain independence for 15, 20 to 25 years. But there is not a single industry in their country. Africa has been oppressed by the white colonialization for so many years. For so many years. But even after African countries, they gain independence, the white people, they keep on following to suppress the countries, to suppress the African communities. And one of the things that the Western countries, they are making Africa to look like they are the one who are in need of them. They are the one who are in need of the Western countries. But we know for sure that they are the ones that are aligning themselves with the continent because of the natural resources that the continent have. Look at these things where they said they keep Africa underdeveloped through their global financial institution. By what? By making the African countries, their governance to be poor, so that they can go back to IMF to borrow money. And we know for sure that once they go to IMF, there are a lot of restrictions that are coming along with this loan. So this is another way to trap the African continent under their supervision. So what Africa wants is them to be industrialized, is them to create a job for their own people. Because now we have a lot of Africans that are moved to their countries. Why? Because the raw material that they are taking or they are uprooting from Africa, they are going to create a job for their own people that side, leaving many Africans to die in the sea, just because they are following those raw materials to their countries. So Africa has been suppressed for a very long time. But I think as long as the white people also, the Western countries, they are preparing for a big backlash from the black people. As long as they are putting this kind of information on the internet, to do what? To create awareness to the Africans so that we can also start resisting in that way. Or they think Africans, we are ignorant. We just let it pass. Yeah, it's a very sad situation where African countries find themselves, but one day will be one day. Continue watching.
Basically about, so you know what it's about, but I want to just show you the extent to which Africa is specializing in the production of raw materials and basic agricultural goods. We know the basic forces that have caused this underdevelopment. We know it's colonization. I will not discuss that very much because my colleague speaker is going to go into some aspects of this. But I do want to discuss the global economic structures, the global financial institutions, and economic ideology, briefly, to give you a flavor of those. Let me start with this. You can't really see it so easily, but if those of you who are interested, you want the PowerPoint, I'm sure we can make it available to you. But the thing that you really need to see is the top line. Okay? And the extent of dependency is captured by this statistic at the top. Okay? And you compare it with all other income groups, and what you see is essentially in that one statistic how dependent Sub-Saharan Africa is on raw material production. Okay? This is the very heart of what makes Sub-Saharan Africa beat. Okay?
Another thing that they did to African countries, they group most of the country, all the countries in the world, not only Africa. By grouping them is to say, your country is rich in diamond, your value of your country is this. And if you don't have any raw material in your country is worth this. And this is the problem that we find ourselves in the continent. Because for them to come to buy those raw materials to you, they already know. So they will just create a situation in your country where you are going to depend on the aid. And if you are refusing the aid, then they will create a chaos, civil unrest in your country. So these are the situations that they are capable of doing just by categorizing countries in Africa with their raw materials that they have in a country. So it's a very bad situation.
Here, just to have a look at one very important additional statistic, with all this export coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, how much does Sub-Saharan Africa account for in terms of global trade value? We know there are vast resources coming from there, but look at the bottom line in terms of global trade value. Look at that. 0.5%, 1975, 0.95%, going down to 0.1. To 0.1. Meaning that with all these vast resources being produced, how much are they getting for it? Nothing. Nothing. This is a very significant piece of data. Then I just want to show you what has happened to Sub-Saharan Africa, because what we know, and from all studies, no country ever develops without manufacturing. Okay, producing raw materials will not take you anywhere. Producing basic agricultural goods will not take you anywhere. And let's have a look at how much manufacturing activity takes place in Sub-Saharan Africa. We can look over the last 15 odd years, 15, 20 years.
This is what African countries are facing. So let us look at one of the examples. One of the African countries in Southern Africa, Congo DRC. Since their independence, they just have civil unrest upon civil unrest just because of the raw material. And we understand that as DRC is full of raw material, the villages that are in Eastern DRC or wherever in DRC, there's a lot of airstrip, meaning that the aircraft can come and land in any village in DRC and load their raw materials. Meaning, what is the situation currently in DRC? Is war that has been there for maybe 12 years or 15 years. And what is the cause of this war? It's mineral. Since we know that DRC is very, very rich in the mineral. So these are the situation that African countries, they find themselves in. And if they are resisting to say, stop, we don't want to give you our raw material unless you buy them on this price that is on the market, they won't. And again, they are the ones that are also determining this market price. So there is no way to say, even if you give them the raw material to buy them in a legal way, still this raw material is going to be bought on the lowest price. So what is the need? So Africa.
And we see manufacturing has actually declined as a percentage of the total. This is percentages of total production in Sub-Saharan Africa. How much of it is accounted for by manufacturing? So this figure here is 17% of the total. Most of the rest, when we talk of industry, it includes manufacturing, but the bulk of it is mining. Okay? Raw material extraction. This is the bulk of it. And here we see actually raw material extraction has stayed the same. What has caused industry to fall is the fall in manufacturing production. This is deliberate because we will never, as Western economists, as Western policymakers, we cannot afford to allow Africa to industrialize and start producing manufactures. Okay, so we will do everything to stop that. And I'm going to show you how we act.
But why can't they allow African to go 50-50? Because if they make, or if they really care about the continent, why can't they go 50-50? We are going to give you 50% to industrialize, as long as you are going to give us this raw material. In that way, they are practicing democracy. Or they can also show that they are there for African also, at least to test what it's like, or what it's like to live in a developed countries. But for them to reject, it's another thing. It's another thing. They're supposed to share 50-50.
Actually block that. It's obvious in certain ways, but it's less obvious in other ways. Now we have actually seen periods of rapid growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, misleading people, saying, oh, you know, we're now doing much better. And this has happened recently. Recently, I've had students come and tell me, we've done much better now. And you can see growth rates rose quite sharply in recent times. Now are starting to go again down. But if you look historically, the same thing happened earlier. Why? Because in these two periods, we had East Asian rapid industrialization processes. So in the earlier period, we had Japan and Korea and Taiwan. Okay, rapid growth, sucking in raw materials from Africa, drive driving up the prices. And then Sub-Saharan African countries grew. Exporting raw materials, they grew. But after those countries finished industrialization, then Sub-Saharan African growth rate again fell. Okay, but along comes China. Next wave. Okay, again, Sub-Saharan African growth rises, but now China is going down. As many of you now know from the press, China is going down. But Sub-Saharan Africa is going down even faster. And we're going to go back to where we were again, with very low prices of raw materials, very low growth rates, and again, the sorts of poverty that we saw once before. Because, bottom line, Sub-Saharan Africa is condemned to this role, just the supplier of raw materials, not a manufacturer. Very recent data showing emerging markets that produce raw materials against emerging markets that produce manufactures. And you can see now with the weakness in the global economy, it's the emerging markets, that's the red line, it's those countries that are suffering the most, the emerging markets producing raw materials. They're suffering the most. And here it translates into their currencies being butchered. Okay? The currencies are collapsing of these countries, and many of them are Sub-Saharan African countries. Some of them are Latin American countries, okay, who also rode that same wave. They thought that raw material production was going to save them. But now they're facing terrible problems. And I'm sorry to say, it's just going to get worse in the next 2 years. It's not going to get any better. And this is what it does in terms of gross domestic product. It's the blue line you should look at. It's the blue line compared with the red line. And what we know is that blue line is really going to go down sharply in the next 2 years. Okay, so relative to the rest of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa is going to suffer. Again, why? Because it's condemned to this raw material production. This is basically why. How is it condemned to that? Well, the first and most important is the economic structures. After colonization ended, we needed new structures to keep these countries where they were. Okay? And the first of those is aid. Okay? We give them aid. Aid for what? Actually, we give them aid to keep repressive regimes in power. That's all. Okay? We're not giving them aid for much more, except a little bit of infrastructure to make sure those raw materials get to the ports and aren't gotten out of the ground. But for the most part, we give repressive regimes money and power and guns to keep that system going. This is what it's fundamentally about. All the hypocrisy about transparency and democracy and bullshit like that, it's all bullshit. You know? And at least the Chinese don't enter into that bullshit. They say, we don't care about the whole political environment, we just give the money. Okay? And it's for raw material extraction. Period. Okay? Number 2.
Wow. So, this is what we are talking about. These Western countries, they know what they're doing. As we know, the presence of Chinese in African continent, it's very sad how African we view those Western people or Western countries, or how we view also China sometimes. Because if China is belong to the West, we don't care whether they are capitalist or they are socialist, as long as which category is China falling. If it's obviously China is falling under Western countries, then it's one of them. So African, they just need to know who is there for them. And this issue again for 9 alignment, it's also having the advantage and a disadvantage when it's come to these things. But as long as the good governance, the corruptions, the apartheid is still existing in those countries, Africa will not develop. Africa will not meet that realization to say we want to industrialize now. For example, if we really want to take China seriously, why can't China, for the longest years that they have been existing in Africa freely, why can't they set up an industrial, a factory somewhere in one of the African countries so that we can be proud for that? But for them to set up roads, airports, we know that these are the things to connect the dots so that they can make their way smooth in the country when it's coming to exploit the country's raw material. So Africa is in problem. But we are awakened now, we are speaking now, and as long as people, they are no more in their slumbers, they are waking up now. We are fighting. We are fighting for our right. We are fighting also to be under a developed country. Because I remember there's a certain countries in Africa that was placed underdeveloped. But for them to be placed underdeveloped, is that because there were a lot of projects that were running by foreigners in that country that assist that country to be placed or marked as a developed country. But as soon as within that year, the country is ranked as a developed country within Africa, all the donors, they left. And when the donor left, the country started to cry again. Because a lot of people, they lose their job, their cars, they were repossessed, and economically, the country was not doing good. So they were rated developed. At the same time, here is Moody coming rating the country to say they are not stable for investors, or the country is not suitable for the investor to come to the country and invest. So when you look at this and you started to think as an African, all these things are just trapped. Because the Western countries, they don't want to leave. So they have to create another situation to say, we can keep you another aid so that we can come and stay in your country. Or why you fell under this situation is because of your management from your leaders. We know that African is having that disease or that sickness of corruption within our leaders. But most of the time, these things, they are being promoted by the Western countries so that the backlash will be placed on the leaders that are on the ground. Or the IMF can come up with this to say, okay, now your country is not doing good and you need this project and this project. You can go to IMF and borrow money from them. And what happened? The IMF can come, assess your country, and later IMF is telling you that maybe your government is bloated. But here you know that you have a lot of unemployed people in the country. But IMF is telling you that you don't need to hire anybody. In fact, you even need to reduce that number of your public servant so that we can give you this loan. So these are the things sometimes that the Western countries, or to say America, they keep on suppressing African countries so that they cannot be developed. They cannot.
And this was a very important one, still is, debt. I was telling some of my students today, was it today or yesterday, about Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You remember this? Have any of you heard of this one? Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's a book written by John Perkins, who used to work for a very nebulous, opaque bank. No one had ever heard of this bank, but it was formed in the 1950s by the IMF, the CIA, and the American State Department. And it had only one job: to lend money to developing countries that were raw material producers in order to indebt them. Once you are in my debt, I control you. Okay? And this bank had 4,000 employees. But no one ever heard of this bank, you see. But it would go to country after country offering loans. And if the president did not accept the loan, they were killed. And he gives two examples of presidents who were killed when they did not accept the loan. You see, the lending is also very important to trap the country. It's very important. It's part of that process. I teach in Suriname. And Suriname in recent times had a huge foreign exchange reserve. So big they didn't need to borrow money. And then one of my students, who was very high up in government, he said, you know, the IMF is trying to convince us to borrow money from foreigners. Why? I thought, duh, you know, sorry about this, but, you know, this is the game. And in the end, Suriname did borrow this money because the IMF said, if foreigners lend to you, then everyone will think Suriname is such a strong economy that foreigners are interested in lending to you. You understand? Before Lula came to power, you know, the previous president in Brazil, Cardoso, his predecessor, took a gigantic international loan. No necessity for taking the loan. Why? Because once I catch you with the debt strings, I hold you forever. You are my prisoner. Okay, so debt has been this huge spider's web which has trapped Sub-Saharan Africa and keeps them held there. Aid, debt. We have a third structure which is again not known by many people, but it's something that was put in place and continues to this very day, with no one discussing it. No one says anything about it. It is monopoly buying structures. This is for all raw materials and basic agricultural goods produced by developing countries. There are only 4 or 5 Western multinationals that buy all those goods. And they collude between them. So if you take any major product, these Western multinationals, they collude between them. Even if we go down to banana production, we had a PhD down here at the ISS, and the person showed that the 4 or 5 major multinationals, they collude, and in order to make sure their control is total, what they do is they force all the producers to produce the same uniform banana. You know, the crap you buy in the West and has no taste at all. You go to any developing country, you know how a banana tastes, don't you? There's so many of them, lots of varieties, but we only market 1 or 2 types, so we have control.
As we heard, and as I narrate that, once your economy of your country is not doing good, the IMF or the International Monetary Fund, they are coming to say you can borrow money to us. Whoever is responsible to take the loan from the IMF, they refuse. We had the consequence. So these are the things that to say most of the time we see that our leaders are doing good. Even most of them, they are corrupt. But we see some, they are trying to do their best. But the one that are pushing them, the one that are behind them, pushing them to take the loans, they get angry if that president refuses to take the loan. And we know the consequence. It's there in the video. And another thing that we know as Africans is the controlling of food production, and the weathers in the atmosphere. If they don't like a certain countries, they just make a catastrophe, whether in Africa or whether in Latin America. The rain, hurricanes, to just come and pull down that country down to the drain. So these are their tactics that they have been putting or using in the world, not only in Africa, but even if they succeed, I think by now the continent has been awakened and people are talking, and now is for the leaders and the scholars that are being trusted to approve these projects that are coming in the forms of assisting the countries. Let's say the country can select a project within the community, and they send the proposal to the West countries so that they can receive the donors. Just for our people to understand this manipulation so that they can stop creating unnecessary projects that are coming in with this fund, so that we cannot be kept under them, under their rules, by means of debt or donors or aid, whatever forms that they wish to give to assist the country. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave your comment down below, and see you on my next one. And bye-bye. Bye.